going on. I don't feel any competition. It is a really, really wonderful womb-like environment to be in. So I will start by talking about my own journey with feminine energy, and then I'll end up with what I'm doing now. So I grew up in a family where I wanted to fix things. My dad was dying from an incurable neurological illness, and my mother had a very strong addiction to gin. So I was the oldest child, and I grew up just wanting to stop my mother from setting the house on fire or choking on her vomit, and wanting to stop my father from dying. Now, I didn't realise that I was powerless over both those two things, that I couldn't actually stop Parkinson's disease, racing through his life, nor could I get between my mother and the bottle. But I tried, and I spent my childhood really, really trying. And when I finally got it that there wasn't anything I could do in the home, I then took that same zest out into the world and thought, how can I stop wrongdoing? So at 14 I was having anti-roads protests with my sisters that weren't very effective because we held up poems. The power of poetry would be enough to make people come to their senses. I've become a lot more practical since then. And I used to watch television. I used to watch Brian Walden on Weekend World, these incredibly powerful journalists who would have the capacity to intervene in politics. And so I looked at them and I thought, well, they had all started by being barristers, so I'll become a barrister. So not before my careers advice lady had told me that I should think about being a secretary at an insurance broker, and where did I get my ideas from? Actually, I hadn't even told her I wanted to be a barrister. I said I wanted to be a secretary at the BBC, and she said, don't you think every girl wants to be a secretary at the BBC? Horsham Insurance Brokers, which is where I was growing up, needs some really good secretaries. I think you should go there. Luckily, I found my way to university. I studied law, and I went off to the bar because I thought I'll try and change the world by changing laws. I got there, and within 4 months I just could not cope. It was an incredibly hierarchical environment. I was in a kind of radically left-wing set of chambers where everyone was there to try and achieve social change, but the clerks were all called by their surname as if they were servants, and the radical barristers were all called sir, and it was impossible. I couldn't function, so I decided to go into television, and I gave myself 5 years, and I said to myself, if within 5 years you can get on national television and be reporting about social injustice, then I'll allow you to be a journalist. If you can't, then you're going to have to slog it out with those horrible men and learn how to speak in ridiculous archaic language and wear one of those wigs that really didn't suit me. And then 5 days before the time was up, I was in the newsroom, and I don't know why I'm going the way I'm going, but this is how I'm going. So I was in the newsroom. I'd done a bit of reporting, but I hadn't got that national position that I had told myself I needed to have. I put in for a job to be ITN's Home Affairs correspondent, but no one knew who I was because I was, timid and shy but passionate, but I just didn't know how to conduct myself in this workplace. And Robert Maxwell fell over the side of his boat, and it was the biggest news story, and they looked around the newsroom and all the real journalists were out covering stories, and they had no one. It was an hour till air, and they had no one to tell the story of the fact that Robert Maxwell had fallen over the board, and so they let me tell it. So 5 days later, I go into this interview on the anniversary of the date I've set by which I have to become a television reporter, or I won't allow myself to do it. And they know who I am because I've already led their news bulletins, and they know I can do it, and I was given that job. Cut to, I then have 8 years where I feel such a privilege, because now, with this microphone and with this camera, I can wake up in the morning, I can look at the front page of a newspaper and I can say, that's a lie, or that's wrong, or that's not okay, and I can get the minister on television, or I can speak to the families that have been wronged, and I can get their voices heard, and I can affect things, and it was such a privilege, and I really loved it. But I only used masculine energy in it. I didn't that I could rest for a second. I felt the weight of that privilege so greatly that I by then I was a single parent with 2 young children, and I would leave the house at 7 in the morning and I would be back after Music Tenor broadcast at 11 at night. And if anyone questioned me, I'd say there are people in prison right now. You know, I went to Bosnia and I uncovered evidence of rape being used as a weapon of war. So there were women being raped that I had to make interventions for. So I carried on working at a completely impossible rate because I felt that I had the capacity to do something, and therefore I must do something. And then one day I woke up and I couldn't go on. It started with a phone call where the news desk called and said, Downing Street have asked you to go there, there's going to be a briefing, they need you there, we'll send a car. And my 2 little children, who were boys, were 2 and 3 then, were in their high chairs throwing food while I was trying to talk on the phone to the news desk and sound competent and not like a working mother, because that was not something the newsroom really enjoyed. And I looked at them and I thought, okay, so I could go to Downing Street and have the big exclusive, or I could stay here and have food thrown at me and be with these 2 little people. And I just said, I can't go, and I can't go, and I never went back to work. And I didn't know what would happen to me. I was a single mother. They signed me off work sick for the first 3 months. And the longer I stayed away for it, the more I knew that I could never go back into that environment and that way of working. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I rented out my rooms so that I would have lodgers, so that I'd have a little trickle of income, but it didn't meet the mortgage. And then when the 3 months of my sick leave were about to run out, I got a call from HR, and they said, you do realise that we insured you, don't you? And I said, what do you mean you insured me? And they said, yes, we insured you against permanent ill health, and we now classify you as having permanent ill health. So you won't have very much money, but you'll have a portion of your salary, and you don't need to work. So that was an extraordinary thing. Anyway, I wasn't able to work, I wasn't able to do very much. I was put on incapacity benefit in addition to this pension that I was given, and I spent 10 years doing the very thing that I had avoided doing, which was going inside. My sense of self had come just from the things that I did, the stories that I told, the interventions that I made, the battles that I fought. If you ask me how I was, I'd tell you what the latest story I was working on was, or what the latest outrage was. I couldn't tell you how I was because I didn't matter, I didn't exist. And so I had absolutely ceased to function as a going human concern. I was largely agoraphobic. I remained in the house. I was very present with my children, which was an extraordinary gift because I never would have allowed myself to do that. So that was the silver lining of the illness. And I spent 10 years really having to rebuild myself from the inside out rather than from the outside in. And you know, my ego took a huge tumble. I went from being watched by 9 or 10 million people every night to not being able to get dressed in the morning, and people would say, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm on benefits, or I'm on permanent ill health, and that really didn't suit my ego, but it was wonderful, wonderful humbling. And I learned what I need to function, and that I can't be of any use in the world unless I meet my own basic needs first. And I also discovered that if I don't meet those basic needs, I start making all sorts of bad decisions. I start going out with the wrong kind of guys, I start eating a whole load of sugar, or I start starving myself, or I start doing a whole manner of things to try and numb how I feel, because I'm not looking after myself. And looking after myself for me involves allowing myself to feel my feelings, giving myself space so that when I'm upset I can feel it and pass through it. You know, I had a depression that they said would never be healed, and that was because I had just refused to feel. While I was in doing masculine mode, I hadn't allowed any of those feelings that I had about my father dying or my mother's alcoholism to surface, or any of those stories that I've told of those people, some of whom weren't alive, some of whom were still in jail. And I had to allow myself to feel. But I also had to look at what made my pilot light grow, and I think that most of us, well, all of us have a little pilot light inside us, and when we're depressed, that pilot light gets absolutely tiny, and when we're solely in our masculine energy, we may be very efficient in the world, but that pilot light gets so fragile that it's almost barely glowing. And I had to work out what would feed that pilot light, what would make me come alive again, and I discovered that it was beauty. I went to art school not having drawn since I was 8. I found myself, again, the miracles that happen, you know, Katie talked about what happens when you let go. I let go and suddenly found myself in Chelsea College of Art studying art. I mean, how does that happen? And all these things I discovered that were gentle, kind, slight, beautiful, subtle things that had no outward worldly value, but absolutely filled my heart. And most of them are in this book. So this book is about that journey, and I wrote it with a friend who's also an actor who had a similar journey, and we were friends, and we spent 10 years trying to find a route out of darkness that didn't involve external validation in order to do it. And fingers crossed, I healed. You know, I know when my pilot's light starts to flicker now, which it does, I absolutely know what I have to do, and I have to tend to that before I tend to anything else. So this book was really about that journey. It was also about something else that so many of us become detached from, which is values. You know, how many of us actually live according to our values? I wasn't. I believed in truth and justice and fairness, but in order to achieve those things, I was willing to ride roughshod over anyone. You know, and I look at society at large, and it's the same. You know, in our homes we practice kindness, sharing, looking out for the weak member of the group, but when you get out the front door, it's sharpen those elbows. You know, I'm going to get to that finish line first, and of course, when we get to the finish line, it evaporates, because there's another finishing line and another finishing line, and in fact there's no finishing to be done. There's only an endless race towards where. So this book was also about the values that we live by, and how many of us have become divorced from those values and are living a life that feels like we're living a value-led life, but actually has been hollowed out by the way in which we're obliged to live in this world. So this book is largely about how to make those changes within yourself, but because I'm a political animal, I then, you know, my heart was breaking about what was happening in the world, and what I observe is that what's happening in the world is a kind of projection almost of what happens to us on our own individual level, just as we're at war with ourselves between self-hatred, greed, compassion, you know, our strong and our masculine and our feminine sides. So, you know, we see those divisions and those conflicts writ large on the international and the national frame. So I looked at all these single issues that I was involved in campaigning for by that time, because my activism had come back, and they were homelessness, they were asylum seekers, they were the rise in hunger, environmental crisis, and I realised that they all had the same root cause. They were all manifestations of the same problem, and it was the same problem that caused my breakdown, and that was a lack of compassion. And you know, I grew up in the 1970s, and in the 1970s there was a very clear consensus in this country that we had a welfare state, that we looked after those who were less fortunate. And through the 80s, I watched how that social contract was gradually snipped. You know, first of all, we were told there was no such thing as society. Then we were told if we wanted work to get on our bike, break up those kinship groups, break up those communities that had actually held us for so long. And then the blame started to enter into the political dialogue, which was, you know, if you're a benefit claimant, you're probably a cheat. You know, that whole hotline of shop a benefit, cheat. So neighbours were encouraged by central government to shop their neighbours. And then the notion of the deserving poor, the victimisation of single parents. You know, you've got to keep your children under control, but you've also got to work full time because we're not going to support you in looking after your children. And so on, so that we end up in the situation we're in now, where we actually have one of the highest infant mortality rates in Western Europe. We've gone from being 9th best to 20th, and that's in 2019 when we're the 5th wealthiest nation. We also have a rising level of mortality amongst women, particularly in poor communities where women are dying younger. And that's, again, inconceivable. And as I'm sure most of you read, the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty issued a report which said that we're returning to Victorian times. So that's the bad news. Now, what can we do about it? So we founded this group, which is what it says on the tin, Compassion in Politics, in October. We launched it at Oxford University because we thought we needed the patriarchy to listen to us. And if we launched it All Souls in Oxford, then they might pay attention. And bless them, they did. They put us on the Today programme because that's what they do. If you have august men in an august institution, you get to go on the programme that politicians listen to. And since then, we've had politicians from 7 political parties in the UK join us. And since Christmas, there have been 2 policy U-turns with compassion cited as the reason. But just because politicians say they're compassionate, it's like saying motherhood and apple pie. It doesn't mean a thing. So the point of the campaign was, its starting point was to get compassion talked about and once again seen as a legitimate political driver. And stage 2 is to do 2 things, which is where we are now. One is to try and use compassion as a unifying principle. So we've got MPs from 7 parties saying that they want to put compassion first. So why don't we start trying to have voting alliances based on whether or not a policy or a piece of law is compassionate? So we're starting to work with MPs to create a cross-party alliance where if the whip's trying to force you to vote for something that isn't compassionate, you have other people that you can talk to and you can stand firm within your own party and with other politicians of other parties. And I don't know if you know, but we now have, I think, at its height, it's been 400 members of both houses of Parliament who have started to meditate. And there's this fantastic group, and many of them have come on board because as they meditate, they realise that the political differences don't mean anything. What really matters is the answers and the solutions. And the other thing that we're trying to do is to introduce or try to persuade Britain to be the first country to have a Compassion Act, so that we actually have in legislation a kind of threshold, so that in future no laws can be passed if they're going to leave the most vulnerable in society worse off. So that would deal with all the worst aspects of austerity should we find ourselves in a similar situation again, which it looks like we might, unfortunately. And the second would be that no law could be passed if it benefited this generation at the expense of the next generation, which would help to deal with climate change. And we had our first meeting, roundtable meeting in Parliament with parliamentarians and academics talking about this last month, and they all said yes, we like it. It was hosted by 5 MPs from different parties. Guess what? They were all women. And but we do have men on board as well, and so we're growing that movement. We just got some fantastic polling back today, which polling is a very, very expensive thing to do, as I'm sure some of you know, which was given to us for free to find out what the levels of appetite for compassion were in the public, and they are very high. So politicians are completely out of step with us. We live with a set of values in our homes that are not reflected in our outside world, and if politicians want us to listen to them and to trust them again, then they need to start putting those values at the centre of the way they do politics. So that is what I'm up to. But at the same time, it's very interesting. When we began with the compassion, lots of news editors and some politicians were like, well, compassion just isn't a political word, and they started to dismiss it in much the same way as I as a woman have been dismissed throughout my career. Very idealistic, well-intentioned, slightly fluffy-headed, a bit all over the place, not dealing with statistics and hard facts. But actually, compassion is the opposite of that. It's a really hard, courageous, radical lever. And our definition of compassion is it's feeling empathy for another and then acting on the basis of that empathy. So it's about acting. And so please do check us out. Do sign up if you also would like to see Compassion First. Tell other people about it. And I'll just finish with one of the things that I loved most about writing this book was that we had all sorts of fantastic quotes by only women were allowed to be quoted in this book. So I'll just finish with one of the quotes, which is from Marion Wright Edelman, which is, "You must be a flea against injustice. Enough committed fleas fighting strategically can make even the biggest dog uncomfortable and transform even the biggest nation." So here's to fleas.